Hello friends, video number 2 covering Erich Fromm. Man for Himself is the name of the book, and the subtitle is called An Inquiry into the Psychology of Ethics. So in our first video we covered chapters 1 and 2. Today I'm going to move forward and try and get through as much as I can to keep you up to date on this book. The next chapter, the first video covered chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 3 is called Human Nature and Character. And so, as the title suggests, Man for Himself, Erich Fromm builds on the foundation from William James and others and relies heavily upon his contemporary Sigmund Freud, psychoanalysis, trying to resolve the human condition and explain the human condition based on the inner workings of the subconscious and the conscious. But essentially, man for himself, it leaves out any of the metaphysical. And I'm going to show you how this applies in this chapter. In this chapter, he said, he's referencing Spinoza, talking about different things. And he says here, man has tried to negate this situation. He's talking about the situation of the condition of man. And by man, he means mankind, the collective man. So man and woman together. He says, for example, the Christian concept of immortality, which by postulating an immortal soul, denies the tragic fact that man's life ends with death. Do you see what the author did there? He says that Christian concept of immortality, by suggesting that the immortal soul exists long after we die, denies the tragic fact that man's life ends with death. In other words, the author inserts his belief into that statement. And his belief is this tragic fact, he calls it. He believes that man's life ends with death. And so, because that is the premise that he's using, it colors all his research into the human psyche. It colors all his perception of the solution to our mental problems. And he goes on to discuss mental problems in great detail, as we'll see a little later. But this is the problem that we're dealing with from the get-go. So right out of the gate, the author tells us that he doesn't believe in the immortality of the soul. So how is it possible for any person to make sense out of life? Without an immortal soul, life becomes meaningless. It becomes futile. Even Solomon said the same thing. He said, the rich and the poor, the noble and the fool, it doesn't matter because they all end up in the same place. All is vanity. Just based on if you're only going on what you can see, then life becomes meaningless, becomes futile, it becomes brutish, it becomes short and irrelevant. Pardon me, I'm just going to have a little sip of Java as we move on here. Now, last video I mentioned about how the absolute, how the external authoritarian-based ethics that we received from God in the major religions of the world, the ones that didn't receive it directly received it in their own conscience, according to Romans. But as I mentioned in the last one, I said that it switched from many commandments, then it got distilled down to the 10 commandments, then we had the 2 commandments, love God and love your neighbor, and then we went even further into the law of liberty. Now, someone mentioned to me that, but the teacher told us that not one tittle of the law, not one jot of the law is going to be negated. Yes, that's correct. And that is embodied within the law of liberty, because the law of liberty is described in the book of James, and it says that the law will be merciful to the one who's shown mercy, and the law is going to be severe to the one that didn't show any mercy. So in other words, the instructions essentially are telling us that the law has become embedded within our own hearts. Remember how before he left in John, he said the three things that the Spirit is going to accomplish: of righteousness and sin and judgment. Sin, because they didn't believe in him when he came to visit the earth. Of righteousness, because he's gone and we believe, so we are imputed righteousness because of our faith. And judgment, because the prince of this world has been judged because of that magnificent event on Calvary. Those three things. And so these things have percolated down into the heart, into the hearts collectively of humanity. And we incorporate that together with the law of liberty as we're instructed in James. James is a very special book. Besides the introduction, the greeting is essentially a transcription, I believe, of the teachings of Christ himself. There is no other book in the New Testament that has the same delivery, the same impact, the same perspective as the book of James. This is why I believe it is a very special book. I believe it is an actual transcription of the words of Christ. Otherwise, the words don't make any sense if they were coming from a human. Now, they could be coming from James, the brother of Jesus. I could be wrong, and perhaps he just memorized what he said. But even so, you read those words and you recognize who is speaking behind those words. You hear what I'm saying? If you read those words, you will recognize who is speaking in the book of James. Keep that in mind. And it talks about the law of liberty. And Romans, again, if we jump over to Romans talks about those that don't have a knowledge of Christ or didn't grow up in that religion, or they had no concept, or from a different culture. It says that their own conscience becomes the law embedded in their hearts that either convicts them or absolves them. Their own hearts, right? So what Erich Fromm rejects is the concept of an absolute. But what we're told through ancient scripture is that the external absolute has percolated down into our hearts on an individual level. When Christ came, the first thing he taught were not 10 commandments, but there were 10 blessings. Well, 9, 8, 9. You could stretch it into 9 or 10 if you extrapolate the last one into 2 different. But what were they? The Beatitudes. He said, blessed are those who are of a broken spirit. Blessed are the meek. They shall inherit the earth. He gave all these 9 blessings. So instead of coming out with commandments, he came out with blessings. And he shared people the good news of the gospel that God is able to deal with us individually. So out of the gate, when Erich Fromm joins together with William James using a humanistic, atheistic foundation, that man is only dependent upon himself. Man has no hope. As he mentions here on page 51, the tragic fact that man's life ends with death. Wrong. It's not true. He is lying. This man lied to you. And this psychoanalysis theory has been built upon by more and more people, right? Sigmund Freud might have been a genius in many ways, but he was basically just very imaginative. He came up with all these ideas of explaining human behavior because of these unconscious conflicts that existed. So I'll try and move on. I hope that somehow makes a little bit of sense to you. I know that what I'm saying is difficult to grasp, but maybe if you go through it a couple of times and read the first few chapters of Romans, read through the book of James, and then read through the last few chapters of the Gospel of John, it may start to, as I use the term, percolate. It has to dwell in your mind and spirit for a while. You basically have to feed on it for a while for it to make sense, because it is a spiritual concept. And we're told that spiritual concepts are contrary to the natural nature, the physical nature. It's not something that is easily digestible like food. You know, you eat physical food and it's very easy for your body to digest it. Whereas spiritual concepts are difficult to get through into the deep part of your heart. You kind of have to dwell on them, feed on them, meditate on them, and ask for God's Spirit to give you an understanding of those things. And it's very easy to suffer shipwreck because there are so many barriers that try and oppose that. In fact, there are many influences from Christians themselves, brothers and sisters with good motives and good understanding, but have not accepted the law of liberty. And instead, they have a law unto themselves which is conducive to isolation and antagonism between one another. It's not a law of liberty. It's a law of the letter of the law. And once you get to the letter of the law, there is no mercy, because it can always be interpreted as guilty. Don't forget, in James, we're told that if a person is guilty of one part of the law, they're guilty of all of it. And so there's a futility in trying to follow the letter of the law. And many people are using the letter of the law as representation of their connection to the metaphysical. They say, because I follow these postulates, because I follow these commandments, because I follow this doctrine, this makes me into an elevated state where I can therefore judge others. And it creates all kinds of pain and suffering and misunderstandings. But I'm not going to get into that because that's for another video. So he goes on to explaining different types of character. Erich Fromm starts to introduce Freud's concept of his basis for human behavior, and I'm not gonna go into that. I mean, Erich Fromm was a very insightful person. He says here, complete isolation is unbearable and incompatible with sanity. He knew how dangerous isolation was. And so I'm going to move forward. And he goes on to describe different types of characters. So what he does in this next chapter called Human Nature and Character, he creates these different categories of character and describes all the different types of neuroses that they suffer from. And the problem with this is that as you read through it, you realize that what he's doing is almost like a anthropomorphic application of human frailties, human neuroses. You know, when you read a astrology, for example, you have a whole group of astrological um, information. Let's say if you were born in this month, this is your news for today. If you were born in this month, this is your news for today. And if you read under the month that corresponds to your astrological sign, you'll say, oh my, this is very insightful. It sounds like something that applies to me. Whereas if you were to randomize it and switch them all around, you would still feel the same way. But because you recognize those things in your own life, you ascribe some validity to them. This is what happens in the different types of character that Fromm goes through and lists. He talks about the receptive orientation, and he talks about a person that is exploitive orientation. He talks about people that look for solutions outside of themselves. He talks about people that look for solutions inside of themselves. He talks about the hoarding orientation, the people that are hoarders. And so he goes through and talks about all these different types of characters, and he also takes a slight, I should mention that he takes a slight at Christianity. He says here that in our culture, the picture is particularly deceptive because most people believe in monotheism while their actual devotion belongs to systems which are indeed much closer to totemism and worship of idols than to any form of Christianity. So in other words, he says that most Christians are hypocritical. They say that they're monotheistic, but they're actually trying to worship things like success and status and power. And when he gets into these topics, his comments are actually relevant to today because he talks about how much culture affects human nature. He says that the most important means of transmitting these personality patterns in the average man is the motion picture. He talks about pictorial magazines, newspapers, newsreels, and all these things. They show successful people, and what ends up happening is people start to strive to copy those things, and that would be relevant to today as well with Instagram and all that. So in that sense, he was a bit ahead of his time. He talks about how people are so concerned with self-esteem and success and the image of success, and they identify with what they're able to achieve, and the end result is causing all these negative personality traits, neuroses. And of course, this is where the psychologist comes in to try and heal the person by explaining the cause of their neuroses and then providing them with a solution by getting them to be more introspective, getting them to realize the cause of this, because you got distracted by this and so on and so forth. So it's very insightful in terms of all the different characteristics of humanity, and he tries to give an explanation of where all these problems come from. But because his foundation is based only on this temporal realm, he's saying, there is nothing outside of this earth for a solution, then his efforts are destined to be futile. Now, I'm going to give him credit. I've reached page 90, so I'm going to try and move forward and get this done as quick as I can because I don't want to spend too much time on it because I believe his foundation is flawed. So I want to get through this book and process it as quick as I can. Very insightful when he's discussing the different problems that humans face in our lives by getting distracted with the struggle for power and prestige. But I'll talk more about that in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. God bless you. I love you very much. I hope you have yourself a great day. Sorry to drone on a little too long, but We'll get through it as quick as we can. We'll talk to you again very soon.